Mick, I'll start with you, if I may. Not to make you speak for the Trump administration, but there's been a notable silence from top officials, whether in the Biden, the Obama, the Trump administration, on the tragic and shockingly swift events in Afghanistan and the diminished standing the U.S. may now have in the world. I mean, you see the Chinese, they're on social media talking about, the U.S. took 20 years, in Afghanistan, and they were run out of there in 72 hours. What's your response?
That the Chinese are asking the right questions, which is, and you mentioned it in your run-up to this segment, which is, where did the intelligence fail? Don and I were both told for years that things were going fine, that the Afghanis were learning how to take care of themselves, and that very soon we would be able to leave. It looks like both members of the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats alike, got really, really bad information from the Pentagon and from our own intelligence communities. It doesn't surprise me that that was one of the subjects of the phone call yesterday. You could make it a partisan thing if you want to, and certainly will fall to the Biden administration as to execute this plan. But when things are finished and the dust settles, one of the questions that will need to be asked is, why was Congress misled all these years by the Pentagon? We spent 20 years, $80 billion training the Afghanis, 10 times that elsewhere in Afghanistan, and it fell apart in 72 hours. So it's the right questions to ask. I don't think it's necessarily a partisan issue right now.
But to be clear, then you're pointing the finger at the military here and saying it's their fault that this was such an immense intelligence failure?
I'm just telling you what we were told in the Trump administration, what Don and I were told when we were in Congress, that the Afghanis were very close to being able to take care of themselves. And clearly that was not accurate. And I think it bears questioning after this as to why the information was so wrong and why people are now so surprised that the country fell in 72 hours after 20 years of American assistance and presence in that nation.
One more question, Mick, and then Donna, of course, will bring you in. But, when you say that there was this understanding or, that you were told that the Afghans were ready to take care of themselves, I can't imagine that people really took that as at face value and said, okay, sure, sounds great. I mean, there must have been a healthy dose of skepticism about whether that could ever be true, right?
And there is, and I was one of those skeptics, but it was always, well, they're not ready yet, but they're getting there. It was never, we have to stay forever, which is what I think you're seeing now. What would have been the honest answer was that, what's the plan for the U.S. presence in Afghanistan? If they had given honest answers, it would have been, we need to stay there forever because the Afghanis will never be able to take care of themselves. That's not what we heard out of the Pentagon for the last 20 years.
And Donna, it's really interesting because as disappointing, I think, as the events of the weekend are, and as frankly, as bad as the Biden administration might look, there's a lot of the U.S. public who also watches these events and says that's why we shouldn't be there. That what were we going to do? Stay another 20? I mean, an open-ended commitment, an open-ended financial commitment as well. What are your thoughts as you watch everything that has come to pass? Was there a better way to extricate ourselves from this involvement? And in retrospect, was it really that important to leave so quickly?
Well, I'm not really sure that there was a better way because, frankly, and I will disagree a little bit with Mick on this, that I think that years ago, probably a decade ago, we knew that the Afghan military in various fights or other where the United States was assisting would kind of give up. And at that time, the decision was made to put more money into training and technical assistance and advice, billions more. And here we are another decade later, and clearly the Afghan military simply has not had the will to fight for its own country. And I'm not really sure that, whether this outcome would have taken place if we had done a drawdown over a several-month period, or we waited another year or another 5 years. That this, I think, was inevitable. I think one of the big miscalculations on Afghanistan is that we and our allies really tried to put in place a central government for a country that for generations and generations, thousands of years, had existed in a tribal framework. And it was like fitting a square peg into a round hole. And it never really took hold. And so I think that it's tragic. I feel for the women and girls who had made some advancements over this last 20 years that they now fall under Taliban rule, and it's going to be a disaster for them. But I agree with the Biden administration that We cannot continue to be engaged in a never-ending civil war in Afghanistan. And if the Afghan people can't stand up and take care of themselves, the United States can't do it for them.